angels waging war in the unseen realm. Global events fulfilling biblical prophecy. Eternal life. What lies beyond mortality? From analyzing the paranormal from a biblical worldview to the discussion of cutting-edge science and technology, conspiracy, discovery, special investigative reports. Unafraid to explore the challenging issues facing humanity. Welcome to another edition of Skywatch TV.
Hi folks, this is Tom Horn coming to you week 2 actually, in probably the most fantastic, most interesting conversation I can remember in a long time with my very good friends Steve Quayle and Timothy Alberino. Great to have you guys back again, Steve.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and as you know, Tom, we do like 30-minute introductions. So now we've got to get to some of the most interesting information that's out there. And again, I want to make it clear to everyone, our goal, Tom, is to not only just show that obviously there were giants in those days, we're talking about following a theme of cover-up of the true history of the world, the role that giants played, and what possibly does anyone have to gain by keeping this stuff to themselves. Well, let me show, and I just want to show a picture, and we're going to turn it over to Tim. This is an interesting picture that was drawn, an illustration by a pilot that came out of Afghanistan. And basically, he was talking about the dead giant, this particular giant, and this was a scene that was described to him by the military. Well, after this group of Marines was pretty much murdered and, let's just say this, eaten, the point being is they had to send a specialized team in there, and the actual letter that the pilot who flew the dead giant, 2005, out of Afghanistan is incorporated in the Long Walkers book, which we're going to throw in, make available to people.
Right. Yeah, we're going to be making that book available to them for free, and I think that image is also partly part of the cover. On the cover, if I was to spread this out and essentially break the book, you'd see him on the ground there dead in front of a bunch of Marines. And I also understand that there's been some some threats against the life of the pilot or something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Tim can attest to that, because in both Sardinia and in South America, they were always followed, and I'll let him tell. But here's the central theme. As Tim has been able to interview eyewitnesses to the extraction of the giants, both in Sardinia and South America. But it's fascinating that a lot of those elderly people are now dying, and with them their stories, and even their younger, in this case, Tim, tell the story about the guy on the raft in Lake Titicaca, because that's a good example of actual eyewitness testimony.
And just before you do, for those that may not understand what we're talking about at this moment, it's this brand new documentary, actually, that Timothy Alberino lived in Peru for 10 years. Steve Quayle, the Gen 6 Productions, True Legends, the documentary film series. This is the very first entry. It's a large budget production called The Technology of the Fallen. We already knew, based on some research, some of this information in Peru that's been available for some time, but then you went there, Timothy, and some very interesting things. I mean, I think God gave you favor, because you're asking officials if they ever saw giants, if there was any proof. We talked about this on the last show, and they actually give you access to the historical library, from the 1500s that have the stories, the chronicles of the conquistadors talking about these giants, right, that were in the land, and you have that in the documentary film.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the fascinating things. People say, "Oh, there's no cover-up." Well, if there's no cover-up, then somebody explain to me why so many historians have pored over these documents in order to write the history of the conquest and have completely omitted all of this information about giants and giant bones. And the story from the historians is that, well, they disregard the bones because people were commonly mistaking mastodon bones and giant sloth bones for giant bones, which is false. That's on its face false, because in these documents, these guys are finding the heads. Mm-hmm. And there's no way anybody is going to mistake a mastodon skull with that of a human being. They're finding the heads. And not only that, the giants built villages, they built houses, they dug wells, especially in the case of the giants that landed on the peninsula of Santa Elena, which is now part of Ecuador. Those giants built houses and dug wells that during the time of the conquest and after, the remains of their houses were still there.
So you're saying the giant sloth probably didn't build a house and drill the wells?
Unless mastodons and giant sloths can build houses and dig wells, then we're dealing with giants.
And I can imagine, though, some people watching this program, they're going to say this question: well, if there were giants in the earth in those days, I guess if you believe the Bible, then you believe this, right? What happened to the bones? Where'd they go?
Well, exactly where we've always thought that they go. Exactly what we've always thought happened to the bones is what's borne out in the historical record. In fact, there's a Jesuit priest named Pablo Jose Arriaga, very famous guy, and he came over in the early 1600s into Peru, was sent by probably the Spanish, the Catholic Church operating in Spain. And his job was to exterminate idolatry in Peru. And he wasn't alone. He was also accompanied by what were called the visitadores, the official inspectors that came from the state of Spain, from the Kingdom of Spain, were accompanying him, and they were exterminating idolatry in Peru, along with the Inquisition, which was immediately established in Lima after the conquest of the Inca. And so as Pablo Jose Arriaga is going around getting rid of the natives' idols, burning their shrines and all this, they began to realize that the natives were worshiping the giants. And they weren't just worshiping little idols of the giants, they were actually worshiping the corpses of giants. And they had the corpses enshrined. And there's a story that Pablo Jose Arriaga, along with the official inspectors, this is well documented, went into a cave, found 3 massive giants and many dead bodies around the giants, which were sacrificed to the giants. The giants were dead. It was their bodies, possibly mummified. And these giants seem to have had elongated skulls, which is interesting because the natives say that those were their progenitors. In other words, the giants were the progenitors of the natives, and the natives worshiped the giants. And these giants were massive, definitely over 15 feet tall, possibly up to 30 feet tall. They were burned. Why were they burned? Pablo Jose Arriaga and the official inspectors were exterminating idolatry. They were worshiping the giants. They burned the bones. They incinerated them. But many of the bones also went to Lima and ended up in the office of the secretary of the Holy Inquisition. We're talking about the Spanish Inquisition, so the worst kind of Inquisition, which is obviously a branch of the Vatican itself. And so, as we found in Sardinia, and as we've believed for a long time, the bones are incinerated when they're found, or they're sent to the Vatican.
Well, it seems like there might be also a little bit of this Inquisition still going on, because as I understand it, while you were over there on this trip, you were followed. There was maybe some presence, the Vatican presence there remaining to this day.
Everybody, Tom, that Tim spoke to always was looking over their shoulder. They were always basically aware of the unseen presence, even in talking about helicopters coming in and excavating the bones of the giants. One of the gentlemen, I won't use his name to bring any heat on him, but they were deathly afraid of that unseen hand. Ladies and gentlemen, they do not want you to know the true history of the world. They who control the history of the world control the future presentation of whatever they want. It's kind of like a giant Hegelian lie. It's like the Smithsonian. Why does the Smithsonian cover up all of the artifacts? And why are people today, Tom, who unearth giants threatened? The most dangerous thing to the people in the world that want to bring about the alien deception is the truth. So the very people that believe they inherited that genetic bloodline, meaning the controllers of the world, Illuminati, globalists, or whatever, they are ready to launch, to thrust under the earth, the most devastating, I would say, lie, the biggest lie in history. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going to believe it. So this is what the expedition, this is what True Legends, Technology of the Fallen, this is what, by the grace of God, either our 9th or however many episodes we have to produce. This is what it's all about.
Now, as I understand it, too, by the way, the conquistadors with the sword, we talked about that in the first program. They pushed the sword through the eye to the back side of the head. You were able to estimate that would have been about 30 to 32.
And let me just do this, too, because we're down here. The fact is that you hold that. This is a sword. Again, this is a forgive me. It's a
Shell-hilt rapier.
Yeah, cup hilt rapier. And even the design of this was carried into the later sword, but 41 inches this blade is. And if you get the feel for that, you've got to understand how big the head was. The head on a 36-foot giant was 6 feet from the neck to the top of the cranium, and that was, they were also, those giant skulls were also very, very, what's the word? They were elongated skulls.
And you have a friend now in Hollywood, and there's a company there. You're actually having them recreate this 6 foot tall, 40-inch wide skull, right?
Absolutely, because it's really difficult for people to even embrace that. And again, when I updated Genesis 6 Giants, the second volume, I incorporated the oldest known documents that I could find. And what I found still wasn't even on the level of the accuracy of the conquistadors. So what's important for people to understand is this. When we went to Sardinia, I just asked Tim when we were taking a break, I said, how long did it take us to pull that expedition together? He said about a week. When we get leads, we want to follow them because obviously there are people that want to shut us down. And when Tim and the crew were explaining who they were followed by in Sardinia, you'd swear the guy watched Raiders of the Lost Ark and didn't know how to dress himself, okay? Meaning that it was just the classic, I don't think he had the same manners, but share with this, Tim, share with them why Sardinia and explain the whole situation with Francis Bacon.
So let me interrupt just for a moment, Steve, because I do want to talk about Francis Bacon. I actually want to know, you get into Sardinia, there's evidence there of this, this whole global story about Atlantis and all of that. And if we get time, I do want to cover that. But I had a couple of questions for you. One, when do you think Pumapunku was actually constructed? And tell me about what you found there.
Well, we simply concur with the Inca and with the conquistadors and with the chroniclers who first came on, the first Westerners really to come upon Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. And they believed that the builders of Pumapunku were a pre-flood civilization, that some of them were giants. That's what they believe. We're not putting words into their mouth. That's what the Inca believed, and that's what a lot of the chroniclers believed. This is a pre-flood civilization that was probably giants and other things, because entities with elongated skulls have been discovered there. But there's also, a lot of people don't know that there's actually records of giant bones being unearthed right underneath Tiwanaku, heads and all. And that's something that nobody really talks about.
Well, you was telling me that you thought that Tiwanaku was a farce. I mean, then we got cut off. We didn't get your chance to explain.
Yeah, I do believe it's a farce, and I'll explain why. Tiwanaku, it's kind of confusing, probably confuses people, because the whole site is called Tiwanaku. That's the native word for it, but the Spanish pronunciation of that was more like Tiwanaku. So Tiwanaku became the town. And then Pumapunku is actually part of the whole Tiwanaku area. And it's only a couple hundred yards away from the rest of everything else that you see on Ancient Aliens and other documentaries that feature that area. But what's interesting, and what nobody else has ever mentioned, and we couldn't believe that no one's ever pointed this out, is that at some of the famous structures in Tiwanaku, such as the Temple of Kalasasaya, which are obviously post-flood constructions and are on a completely different level than what you find at Pumapunku. A lot of people do recognize that. Pumapunku is way older than the rest of the structures that are at Tiwanaku, including the Temple of Kalasasaya. And at Kalasasaya, we were finding artifacts that seem to us to have been brought over from the Pumapunku location, which is much older, and literally staged at the Kalasasaya temple, which is post-flood for sure. And that was obviously very suspicious. Why would they do that? And when I say stage, I mean like there'd be like a bunch of sandstone blocks literally piled up on the side of the walkway with a big andesite megalithic block that belongs over at Pumapunku.
Well, and I had known that many years ago they had repaired the Gate of the Sun. Part of it had collapsed. They put it, but what I didn't know, you're telling me, is they actually moved it.
It wasn't there. Yeah, and they make a point to say, this is what the guides say. We were listening to all the guides that were there. They were saying that the Gate of the Sun was found here in the Temple of Kalasasaya, which is in the post-flood area of Tiwanaku. They made a point to say, this was found here. But we had a guy with us, sort of an insider, a engineer from Peru, from Puno, not far away, across the border, and he told us that's a flat-out lie. Because he was young enough to be there when it wasn't there, when it was somewhere else. And he said they moved it. And he told us they've been staging things. They're moving things.
Now, why are they doing it? Why are they?
Here's why they're doing it. Because one of the biggest cover-up, if not the biggest cover-up, and it relates to everything. It relates to our documentary. It relates to UFOs. It relates to everything, is the reality of the pre-flood world. The reality of the world before the flood of Noah. People cannot accept it.
You're saying that if they leave these artifacts where they are, there is an obvious and then an obvious newer,
which is
pre-flood and post-flood.
Yep.
But by mixing the two together, they can confuse people, and then they're selling an idea.
Right, and they're covering up the truth. You know, the word in all of our investigations, the same thing in your research, my research, our collective research expedition, it's the cover-up. They're afraid of something, and they are totally afraid of the truth. And also in Bolivia, and I want to throw this in because it's cool, there was an announcement of a whole civilization that predated even that which you see, where and it was pyramids. Well, the government now has made it very difficult, and thank God I didn't have to go try and bail these guys out or send a team in to get them out of a Bolivian prison. But that's the thing. They will cover it up at all costs. Because why? Well, right now, governments are paying big money for ancient artifacts, and someday we'll do a story, Tom, on just the artifacts in Desert Storm. You told the story on the radio program, but it's a big deal because we're talking about ancient technology. We're not talking about the Aztec, Inca, and Mayan, whose weapons were so primitive that obviously they couldn't stand against the conquistadors. And even then, here's the deal. They'll talk about the Aztec Empire, the Mayan Empire, the Incan Empire, meaning traditional historians, and even those guys didn't admit they built all the stuff that they're credited with building. They said, we didn't build it. Take it from there.
Well, I do want to ask you about Sardinia, but one other quick thing, because I'd only caught a part of this where you guys were talking about where parts of this almost looked like the stone had been liquefied in some of this construction.
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah, that's in the second episode of our series.
Oh, so I'm really jumping the gun.
No, but that was we shot episode 1 and episode 2 during the same expedition. But it's interesting you mentioned that because it looks like the stones in, for example, the Great Wall of Sacsayhuaman outside of Cusco were poured into place, or somehow whoever built it was able to change the molecular structure of the rock to make it softer, to mold it like Play-Doh. But talking about Sardinia, what we found at Sardinia was on the outside of a lot of the megalithic structures, there is a layer of quartz. So in other words, there's a layer of crystal on the outside of the blocks. And they used to call Atlantis the Shining City. And we were told that it was some kind of to collect the power of the sun and to use it for some kind of an energy source. But it's amazing. Everywhere we went, all the megalithic structures had quartz, were lined with quartz.
So do experts that actually live there, now we're talking about educated men, educators, people that have PhDs or they're historians or they're whatever, that live in that area, are there any there that actually are suspicious?
No, it's absolutely, you can't talk about it. But the guys that we were with, they're from Sardinia, would always joke to us about how the richest people in Sardinia are the archaeologists. I actually asked one of the guys who dug up giant bones with the municipality in Sardinia.
This is amazing
dug
stuff.
them up, and we're talking 9 to 12-foot giants. I asked him, well, what did they do with them? And he looked at me and he said, the Illuminati and the Vatican buy them.
Wow.
And that's why they say that the archaeologists are the richest guys in Sardinia.
Yeah.
Because they dig them up. They deny their existence. Dig them up in the background and sell them.
Yeah, and of course we know that the Vatican has an interest in this worldwide. That was me and Chris Putnam going to the top of Mount Graham and finding out that that's considered to be a portal, and the Vatican was willing to fight all the way through federal court here in the United States to have a presence there. So we know that they do have that interest. We know they probably also have like bottomless pockets, right?
Oh, sure,
so
yeah.
cash is not an issue, right?
Especially when you can print it and it's backed up by nothing.
Right. And you know, the Vatican archives are notoriously known around the world. I mean, this is higher security than the CIA. So, but you also, though, in the last program, you mentioned something about Francis Bacon and some connection. And before we run out of time on this program today, I want you to say something.
Yeah, the
about
connection with Francis Bacon is basically this idea of Atlantis, because there's evidence to suggest that Sardinia was Atlantis. Now, I'm not saying it was, we're not saying that unequivocally, but there's evidence that points to the fact that it may in fact have been Atlantis, the site of Atlantis. There's huge pyramids, there's massive structures there. But listen, we were at an area in Sardinia where there was tombs. They call them they actually call some of the places the tombs of the giants. Mm-hmm. And some tourists go over there, but there's places where nobody goes. It's just fenced off. And in front of the megalithic sites, they literally have planted rows of trees so you can't see them. From the villages, there's nothing to see here. You go behind them and they're giant tombs.
Oh, wow.
And so the connection with Atlantis, Atlantis was said to have a succession of rings around it leading all the way down, riverways that led all the way down consecutively to the ocean. So you could come from the ocean, circle all the way around to the pinnacle of Atlantis. There's evidence of that kind of waterway on Sardinia. In fact, we found these massive old iron rings that were about 40 to 50 pounds, and they're sticking into megalithic structures where there is no river. In other words, there used to be a river there. And the guy that's doing research there said if you trace them, it loops around Sardinia, just like the description.
Spiral.
Yeah, and I didn't believe him because I've done a lot of research on Atlantis. I thought everybody's going to say that where I live used to be Atlantis, you know. So I didn't believe him until we're driving around the corner, and he's telling me the whole time, Tim, I think that Sardinia is Atlantis. Actually, he was just telling me, Tim, Sardinia was Atlantis. And I was kind of skeptical, and I still am, but we drive around the corner, and there's a pyramid. Just out of nowhere, I'm looking at a pyramid. And it's not a pyramid like the pyramids in Giza with the bare rock. It's covered with mud and grass by now. But it's a massive pyramid, and there's a castle, an old castle built on top. And I asked him, why have I never seen this? I mean, who knows about the huge pyramids in Sardinia? Hardly anybody. He said, you're not allowed. You know, you're basically, the archaeologists, the historians aren't really allowed to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. This is episode number 1, Technology of the Fallen. True Legends. It's a brand new documentary series. As I understand it, the first project was fully funded, and I won't tell you how much money it took for them to do this, but it was a lot of money, and thank goodness that they were able to come up with it. We're making this available to you. We're the first ones that are doing televised programs on this for $24.95. Some of this research started with and then surpassed work that was done by our good friend David Flynn, who has now gone to be with the Lord. You can get this by itself. You can get the two of these together for $39.95. That's a $60 value, but during these programs, you can get those two together. On the next program, we're going to be talking about, Steve, your books, these things could be used for doing exercises. They're always so big. We're going to be talking about aliens and fallen angels. We're going to be talking about angel wars. And then one of my favorite subjects, we're going to be talking about xenogenesis, and this is going to explain CRISPR technology and other technologies. We're making these 3 books available. Normally, these 3 books by themselves would cost $128. They're $40 books. One of them's a $30 book. This is an $18 book. And this actually has the image in it of the giant that was flown out. You talked about it earlier in the program. We're giving you that book for free.
Yeah, Tom, that doesn't have the image. It has the letter from the actual pilot.
All right, so the letter from the actual pilot that worked to fly the giant out is replicated inside of this book. All three of these together with this free book would be $128 value. We're making them available to you for $99 during this program, all four of those books. And of course, if you want to buy everything that I just showed you, the True Legends documentary, the David Flynn collection, all four of those other books, which would be a $190 value. We've made a deal with our good friend Steve Quayle here. We can make those available to you for $129.95 if you want all of them. There they are, available in all kinds of different ways and collections for you to be able to get. We're going to have Steve Quayle's going to come back next week. We're going to continue shooting films and shooting films about the documentary and the books that Steve's written. Timothy, absolutely wonderful to have you on the program with us for the last 2 weeks. Steve, great as always. Folks, continue to tune in. I think we've just gotten started. The legendary Steve Quayle and Timothy Alberino. You want to check this out. It's their brand new, it's Genesis 6, which is a production company. They're there, they're on the grounds, they're uncovering information that, as a researcher, I've been doing this kind of stuff for many, many years, most of my adult life, and I was absolutely not aware of much of what is in this documentary series. Thank you for tuning in today to Skywatch Television. I'm Tom Horn. I'll see you next time.
Coming this November.
I'm not sure that the world is ready to receive this.
Tom Horn. Joe Ardis, Donna Howell, and the Skywatch investigation team join a host of global experts in the conclusion of a multi-year undercover inquiry that exposes what the U.S. government, the FDA, and monster corporations have been hiding from you.
We're talking about everything from the food that we eat to animals and pet animals to ultimately humans. Literally, what we have been doing with genetically modified crops, what we have and are doing with transgenically made animals, we fully intend to do with the human race. I mean, how many people know right now that the last scientist in Congress, Bill Foster, recently spoke before Congress. He wrote an article for The Hill in which he says that right now the top science departments in our government that dole out taxpayer-funded revenue have already been ordered to literally create the guidelines that are going to be used for genetically modifying the human race.
I think 90% of Americans would be shocked if they learned that their cats and dogs were eating these diseased meats and euthanized pets.
During our investigation, we were able to verify that if your pet Fluffy had been euthanized at one of these vet clinics or one of these shelters, it would be recycled into food byproducts, toothpaste, cosmetics, deodorant.
The stench is overwhelming. It's unbelievable.
Coming in November, an unprecedented, official and imposing undercover report that exposes what government agencies and greedy corporations are hiding about a genetic menace that is slowly, quietly, secretly killing and transforming all of creation.
They have made a Faustian deal with the devil. I'm talking about our government. They have sold out the best interest of Americans to greedy monster corporations that are in their back pockets.
Coming this November exclusively from Skywatch TV. Dead Pets Don't Lie. Inhuman the documentary. Survive the Future.